This recent Final Fantasy VII Rebirth interview with Yoshinori Kitase has the internet going absolutely berserk. It sets a destination for Final Fantasy VII, and yet at the same time, the destination makes where things are going somehow even more unclear than it was before. So please go ahead and hit that subscribe button because today is an absolute roller coaster ride. So this latest interview comes from publication Games Radar, titled, "You Can Learn a Lot from The Empire Strikes Back." I'm sure Star Wars fans will have a lot to say about this one in the comments below. Now the first thing here is a bit of wholesome information I'd like to read because I think it's just awesome. He says, "We've done a number of fan events and signings here," Kitase tells Games Radar at the end of French Games Expo. "I think you can really feel the respect towards games creators here. A lot of people stay behind afterwards and they really want to express how much they respect us and what we've made. And that's a bit of a different thing. We don't get that so much in Japan. You know, it's awesome when these developers can come overseas and have a really wonderful experience. You know, we really do deeply appreciate Japanese creators here in the West, and I always find it heartwarming whenever they can come here, have a great experience, know that they are celebrated globally for what they do, and this is awesome." But here is where he says the thing that has everyone discussing. He reiterates something that Nomura has previously said, but it's a little bit more interesting the way Kitase has phrased it. Here is what he had to say. "We are finally going to link up with Advent Children. That is going to be part of the canon," Kitase confirms. "The overall storyline, the development, will not go wildly out in a way that will not add up to Advent Children in the end. I don't think anyone wanted that. That's not what we're looking to create here. But to make sure it doesn't become stale and people know exactly where it's going, that it doesn't just follow the original word for word. We add in extra elements which add that little bit of doubt. Getting the right balance of that is so key. Ultimately, we're not trying to change the story of Final Fantasy VII into something really different. The overall balance wouldn't really allow for that anyway." So this is very fascinating. Both Kitase and Nomura have used this verbiage, link up. Then he says that it will add up to Advent Children in the end. This is some really interesting wording here. Obviously, we don't have the original Japanese, so we don't know exactly how the nuance was phrased. However, just given how this was translated into English, it can really be read in ways that are not as straightforward as you would imagine. Add up to and link up with Advent Children. It doesn't mean that you can play Remake and then watch Advent Children in the same way. To me, it seems to say that it's connecting to Advent Children, but in an ambiguous way, a way that's almost meant to be read that you could play Remake as a substitute for the original, but it doesn't currently feel that way. The new plot elements added with Zack and the Arbiters of Fate, all of these new mysteries suggest that something big is going to happen. If we really are defying destiny, which as they've outlined in previous interviews that destiny is indeed the game's original timeline, well then if we defy destiny and we defied that original timeline, how are things exactly going to go the same? Is it saying that character fates will end up all the same and the movie would still make sense if you played the remake? This is just very difficult to really make sense of. However, it's the one thing that they've repeated multiple times, that they're not going to be changing Final Fantasy VII. But the setup that they have is very leaning toward the idea that Final Fantasy VII is going to be changing. I get that there are new surprises, but how does one readily reconcile what these new surprises are with the idea that it's not changing Final Fantasy VII fundamentally? And by the way, to be clear, I'm not saying that's good or bad. I just don't actually see at the current time how that could actually be reconciled. And if it can be reconciled, then I feel like this kind of spoils things in a way, right? It's essentially saying, don't worry, everything will end up the same as it did in the original Final Fantasy VII, which then makes these new mysteries feel somewhat inconsequential. I guess what I'm really getting at here is I don't fully believe Kitase or Nomura when they say this. I mean, I do. I am sure it will link up to Advent Children, for sure, though not quite in the way that many might expect when they read this. I think that there is something far deeper than what the surface level verbiage is saying here, as I don't think they would ultimately spoil their own mysteries by saying, don't worry, it's going to end up the same as OG. It'll get to the same point. Then Kitase talks about the Star Wars influence. Now, as you probably should know as a Final Fantasy fan, Star Wars has been heavily influential on FF games throughout the years. with references like Biggs and Wedge. Advent Children isn't the only movie influencing Rebirth, though. Trilogies often face the middle chapter problem, where the second installment must build upon the first and lead into the third, and somehow stand as a satisfying piece of entertainment in its own right. It's notoriously difficult to strike a balance, but one film in particular serves as almost a textbook example of how to do it right: The Empire Strikes Back. There's a lot you can learn from that film in terms of how to do a second part of a trilogy, says Kitase. You've got the setup, the setting, the characters, who they are, all explained in the first part. The real role of a second part of a trilogy is to deepen that, to explore it further, to go into the relationships between the characters and how they relate to each other a lot more, which is very much what we focused on here. Also, linking through to the third part, the climax of the trilogy, obviously you have to have big twists, the unexpected aspects, the things that will throw people a little bit, get them motivated to want to see what happens in the end of the story. Like I say, there's a lot you can learn from the film. It's very good to bear in mind of the right way of going about the second part. Much as Kevin Kirshner took over for George Lucas to direct Empire, so too is Hamaguchi stepping up to full director on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth after co-directing Remake with Tetsuya Nomura. You might think that this would be daunting, but Hamaguchi dismisses the suggestion. In terms of pressure, I don't really think that there is a lot, he says. In certain ways, it actually feels the same. Talk about confidence. That is an extremely confident statement to make. Gives me a lot of faith. I really like Hamaguchi. As I said before, he's kind of the guy that I'm rooting for to do the next mainline Final Fantasy. I think that he might be the guy to do Final Fantasy 17 or 18. He has really come up in Creative Business Unit 1 over the years, and I think it'd be awesome to see what he can do with his own project from day one. The article then continues, explaining his own stance on the middle chapter problem. Hamaguchi says, I think the way I'm approaching this game may be slightly different to Mr. Kitase and his perceptions and ideas around the second part of a trilogy. I think unless there is that twist, that change, that step up over the first game, the big trap here is that people get expectations of what the third part is going to be like. You don't want that expectation to become lower. I completely agree. If we don't add in those changes and ramp up everything and make it that bigger, wider experience, and people are going to think they know what's coming. I want to avoid that. I want to keep people wondering. It's very much how we have to approach the change from Remake through to Rebirth. Just making everything bigger and more expansive and deeper. I feel that's my mission as the director now, to really ensure that's where the game goes. In terms of the change in my approach to it, I think that's what I'm very focused on for this second one. This is all some incredibly good words to hear. I adore Hamaguchi's confidence here, and I do think that they have the right mindset for approaching the second game in a trilogy. I feel actually that Rebirth will be the best received games out of the three. This is something that I felt confident about actually even before the first part was released, because I think that section of Final Fantasy VII is really good. It's going to offer enough freedom as well as character moments to really resonate with players. So I absolutely do think that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth will be the height of the trilogy. That's not to say I'm assuming that the third game will be bad or anything. In fact, I think the third game will be quite good as well. However, what's even more hard than the middle child of a trilogy is ending a massive story like this. Ending any story is inherently a difficult thing to do. I'm sure that many of you can think of half a dozen stories that have fantastic beginnings, really incredible middles, and then they just fall off at the end. There's a reason, because at the end, you have to answer all of the mysteries, and answering the mysteries is incredibly difficult because your answer to the mystery has to give context and fulfillment and reward for everyone who's been chasing those mysteries. All the time invested, people wondering where those character arcs will go, making those things satisfying, feel complete, and making people feel like the journey was truly worth it is just an inherently difficult thing to do with any story. This also being said, they mention here that they need to have a really good hook to hook people into the third part, which again leans toward the idea that if it's just Aerith's death as we currently know it, that wouldn't be the big twist that really hooks people into the third part, something we already know. Just like how part 1 didn't just end with the escape to Midgar, I don't think that Rebirth is going to end with just the death of Aerith, at least not how it was in the original game. Now, it may end in her death, but it is going to be presented in some other weird way that is going to guarantee that you want to play the third game. And this is also a very interesting bit of information direction, while Hamaguchi and Kitase remain tight-lipped on what to expect from the remainder of the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy. There is tragically one character who won't be returning: Hamaguchi's cat, Musashi, who was snuck into Final Fantasy VII Remake. This is only in my headcanon here, he says, but personally, I'd like to think that he was caught up in the Sector 7 platefall with Jesse and that lot. He's probably not gonna turn up. While this may seem to read like just a quote about his cat, if you think about it just a little bit harder, it does seem that he's confirming that Jessie is not going to be making it into Rebirth, and that she probably is in fact dead, at least from what we can tell here. This has been a mystery since at the end of Remake, you can see her bandana and her gloves sitting on the desk next to Wedge, and so a lot of people have wondered if somehow she did survive or something like that. But this seems to imply that Jessie ain't gonna be making it back. That being said, it doesn't say that she's explicitly dead. Who knows what's gonna happen in part 3? In fact, bringing her back in part 3 could be another twist. So if you're a Jessie super fan, don't give up hope just yet. But with all of that said, let me know in the comments what you think about this interview, and including the last interview too that Nomura did, where he talked about linking up with Advent Children. Also, Kitase here using the verbiage linking up and adding up to Advent Children, because I think that there's a way you can read it on the surface level, which is obvious, but I also really don't think they mean it on the surface level, especially during that interview when they said that Nomura was kind of giddy when he was talking about it. And that leads me to think they aren't talking about it leading into Advent Children in the way that you play the original game and then you watch the movie back in the day. No, there's a meta story happening here, and I'm hoping it's gonna be a good one. Subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next video.